This is the documentation of the vote, the 13-11 vote, which is stated down here someplace, with the for and against. You can see who was for and who was against. And Adams and Wadsworth were both 9-men, 9-innings guys. The Curry force is referenced in the Knickerbocker minutes as the old Fogies Prevail 13-11, just as Chadwick would later match the innings in his proposed 10-man model to the number of men on the field. He promoted this for the better part of a decade, and it took hold in Cuba, but nowhere else. 10 men to the side, 10 innings to the game. The Knicks were now resolved to recommend a 7-inning game to replace the old custom of playing to 21 runs, which had recently produced a highly unsatisfactory 12-12 tie game called On Account of Darkness. As the New York players began to be more skilled in their play, you would have fewer runs scoring on errors. So 21 runs would not be reached within 2 or 3 or 4 innings, as was the case in the 1830s and 40s. So it encouraged teams under these rules to play for a draw, as in chess. It's a strategy to not lose. Not so honorable in baseball. This proved to be one of the most heated and divisive votes in club history. So at this point, member William Ladd suggested a committee be formed to cooperate with other clubs to decide upon the proper number of players for a match, with its concomitant effect on the number of innings. If the 21-run rule were to be scrapped, that is, this motion carried unanimously, and the committee appointed was Curry and Ladd. Ladd declined, and Adams took his place, thus placing one 7-inning advocate along a 9-inning advocate, as the Knicks pointed toward their next meeting at Smith's Hotel on 462 Broome Street, December 6, 1856, for the purpose of considering a convention of all the clubs. The hot-headed Wadsworth had offered his resignation to the Knicks recently, on July 31st, 1856, then withdrew his resignation on August 26th. Curry resigned on December 6th, the very day of the meeting at Smith's, testifying to how heated the discussion had become. The Knicks proceeded to establish a 3-man commission to enlist the attendance of other clubs at a convention for the purpose of standardizing the rules. The 3 were Wadsworth, Adams, and Grinnell. Which brings us back to the documents auctioned yesterday. This is one of the documents. Now, the laws of baseball were the documents presented to the convention. Also prepared were the rules of baseball, which was a much rougher draft. And if you look up here, you'll see that Adams and Grinnell were going around about the number of innings. At first, they thought 12 innings would be a swell number. So this is what's so great about these documents, that they provide a first draft of history and enable us to reconstruct the thinking behind the game that we have today. In the aftermath of the convention's adoption of 7 innings, on the motion of Mr. Wadsworth, the aggregation reconsidered Section 26 and modified the Knicks' proposal of 7 innings to 9. Clearly, in enlisting the support of other teams against his own, Wadsworth was following his own lead and the express preference of the Adams contingent against the Curry forces, and disowned the Knickerbocker majority. He was Pyrrhic as far as his own future in the club. Made to feel uncomfortable, the Knicks ringer, because remember, he was brought in for his superior playing ability, not because people liked him, failed to appear for a game on June 8, 1857 against the Eagles, though he had been named to play. 6 days later, he resigned for the final time. And by the following month, he was again manning first base with his accustomed panache for his former club, the Gothams. That's our boy, standing at first base. Looks just like him, right? In 1859, Louis F. Wadsworth married Maria Isabel Michotte Fisher, a wealthy widow 9 years his senior, with 2 children from her first marriage. As a Mashut, she had been born into a family of restaurateurs and cafe proprietors in New York and New Jersey that dated back to 1777, with Mashut's Metropolitan Coffee House in operation at 433 Broadway. A later Mashut, James Mashut, invented the donut. And it seems like a wild claim that anyone could have actually invented the donut. There were things called sinkers, but he's the guy who put the hole in it. So, genius all around. After the brief residence in Michigan previously mentioned and a return to New York, the Wadsworth family, stepson Charles kept his Fisher name. Stepdaughter Mary Ann, who had been adopted and was not a Fisher child, became a Wadsworth. They settled in Rockaway, New Jersey in 1863. By 1872 or so, the family had resettled in Plainfield, New Jersey, where Louis became a justice of the peace and later a judge. After his wife's death in 1883, drink and poor management of his assets are said, as you've seen from the obituary, to have left him a pauper. Only recently, i.e. last night, did I learn that his wife's will left 2/3 of her fortune to her sisters. And she was very, very, very land wealthy. The sister was named Susan Mashut Sparks. After some years of selling Sunday newspapers on the streets of Plainfield as his sole source of income, in 1898, Louis F. Wadsworth committed himself to the poorhouse. Bigger, without chopping off something on the right. This is his status in the 1900 census. Details were gotten wrong, but this is where he lived, at the Plainfield Industrial Home. There, according to his obituary in the Hartford Daily Times, belatedly published on April 4th, 1908, although he had died on March 27th, quote, he became sadly dissipated, and it was not long before he was reduced to absolute want. In 1898, the Plainfield Industrial Home was the only haven, and for 10 years he has spent most of his time reading. A veritable bookworm, day after day, he would sit reading. The bent old man on his trips between home and public library was a familiar sight. Always carrying books, and with few words for those he met, he went back and forth. In the summer, he was particularly interested in following the scores of the ball games of the big leagues, and of late years the game was the one great object of interest to him. Of course, no one suspected that he had anything to do with the game. His associates came to forget him. Politicians who had sat in state conventions where he presided and where his exercise of parliamentary rules was able and astute, lost him out of sight. Society, that had insisted on calling him Judge Wadsworth, passed by on the other side. For the last 8 months, he had slowly failed through infirmities of old age. Until his mental capacity was obscured, he rarely, if ever, mentioned his birthplace or alma mater. But in his decay, he would speak of Hartford and of old times 'neath the elms. Now this reeks of nonsense and made up stuff, that last sentence. He had no family of his own, not true. And it is hardly likely that any of his brothers and sisters can be located. That is true. His brother had predeceased him. And he had a sister, but she died before the age of 10. He rarely mentioned them, and as no letters ever came to him. So 10 years at the home without a visitor and without a letter. The attendants at the home surmised that he preferred not to let them know where he was. Someone knew where he was. For only 3 days after his death, his body was interred at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. In a family plot along with James Mashut, the inventor of the donut, Susan Mashut, Philip Mashut, William Sparks and his wife Susan Mashut Sparks, who came in for a third of Wadsworth's wife's last will and testament proceeds. Maria Isabel Mashut Jackson Wadsworth is buried there too. and someone named Sophia Lyons, whose connection to the Mashut family I have yet been able to confirm, but I'm sure it's there. While Abraham G. Mills was searching for the baffling Mr. Wadsworth, his possible trump card to Doubleday, no one connected Louis F. Wadsworth, long-term inmate of the Plainfield Industrial Home, with baseball's invention. With the death of all the Knickerbocker Baseball Club members from their first decade of play, unbeknownst to the baseball world, Wadsworth was the last to go. No one was left to gainsay the declaration by 1909 by Bruce Cartwright that his father had been the one to invent baseball. Because Alexander Cartwright never made that claim for himself. It was only made by his son in the years, 15 years after his death, 16 years after his death. Journalists who should have known better rallied around this alternative theory in reaction to what they saw as the patent absurdity of the claim on behalf of Doubleday. Of course, both claims are driven by the need for a father figure. It's like you have the cola and the uncola. It's a very, very binary view of how baseball began. And it had no father. It grew like topsy. In 3 weeks, I will be at Greenwood Cemetery for the dedication of a grave marker for James White Davis, a member of Curry's old Fogie faction that backed the 7-man and 7-inning plan, who was buried there in pauperdom in 1899, despite a plea in the newspaper asking each Major League Baseball player, and this plea was made in 1893 in the New York Sun, in a letter to Edward Talcott, who was an owner of the Giants, and it was published in the Sun. He asked that every Major League player contribute a dime toward his having a stone or a wooden marker. He never had a marker because not a dime came forward. The reason I'm going in 3 weeks is that we have secured donations, not only for his headstone and for a number of other 19th century worthies, but Major League Baseball has gotten behind this idea too and has made a $10,000 contribution to the fund. I will also visit the gravesite of Louis Fenn Wadsworth, as I did 20 years ago when I made the pilgrimage to Greenwood to visit the graves of Henry Chadwick and 1860s star pitcher Jim Creighton. I will leave a baseball for him with a message. Thank you.